Have you ever noticed something really strange? That yesterday you felt completely unstoppable, like something finally clicked inside you. You made plans, you felt motivated, and you genuinely believed this time would be different. But then just 1 or 2 days later, everything disappears. You wake up the next morning and it's just gone. The motivation, the energy, the clarity, and suddenly everything feels heavier. You start delaying things, you pick up your phone, you scroll through meaningless things and tell yourself you'll start tomorrow. But the worst part is not even that. It's what you start doing to yourself mentally. You begin to think maybe you are lazy, maybe you lack discipline, maybe you are simply not built for this. But what if I told you that you were never actually losing motivation in the first place? What if the problem has almost nothing to do with your willpower and everything to do with something happening inside your brain right now? A mechanism most people never even notice. And the strange thing is that this mechanism does not work the way you think it does. And once you understand it, you will start to see your entire pattern of quitting in a completely different way. But before we go into that, there is a more important question we need to answer first. Why does that feeling of, I can't continue anymore, always show up at exactly the same point every single time? To understand what's really happening, you need to go back to the very beginning. Because something interesting happens at the moment you start something new. Your brain doesn't behave the same way it does during normal routine life. It shifts into a completely different mode. Everything unfamiliar, everything new becomes highly stimulating to it. And at that exact moment, your brain releases a surge of dopamine. Not because you are working hard, but simply because you are doing something new. And that novelty creates a very powerful signal that this matters. Keep going. It feels like a natural energy boost that suddenly makes everything seem easier than it actually is. But the problem is, this feeling was never designed to last. Dopamine is not a long-term fuel source. It is more like a startup bonus, released only when something feels new, and as your brain gets used to it, as things stop being unfamiliar, this system automatically starts to shut down. And that's the exact moment everything begins to feel different. Not because you became weaker, but because the initial chemical push is gone. And the dangerous part is that most people completely misunderstand this stage. They assume they have lost motivation, but in reality, they have only lost the novelty effect. And the more important question is this: if that initial motivation is only a short chemical reaction, then what actually determines whether you continue or quit when that feeling disappears? When that initial excitement disappears, what happens next in your brain is not loss of motivation the way you think it is. It is actually a completely different process. Almost like something inside your mind starts reevaluating whether what you are doing is still worth continuing. And this is where your brain shifts into a cost-benefit calculation mode. It begins asking a very simple but extremely brutal question. Is this still worth the energy I'm spending on it? And you don't realize it, but underneath every thought you have, your brain is constantly updating an internal balance sheet. When you first start, the cost is low and the reward feels high, so everything seems perfectly reasonable. But after a while, the reward starts to drop because nothing feels new anymore, while the cost starts to rise because things become harder, slower, and require more effort. And this imbalance creates a very clear shift in your internal system. And at that point, your brain no longer sees continuation as the optimal choice. It starts sending signals that maybe you should stop, not because you are incapable, but because in its internal accounting system, this investment is no longer profitable enough. And the important part is that you are not consciously making this decision. You simply start feeling bored, heavy, and resistant. But in reality, that feeling is your brain saying the return rate is dropping. And when that happens, most people fall into the same conclusion. Maybe I'm not suited for this. Maybe I don't have talent. But the real question is this: if your brain is constantly acting like a cold economist calculating returns, is there a way to make it keep investing, even when the reward is no longer obvious? If you look closely, there is something strange that happens in real life. There are always people who keep going, even when things become boring, uninteresting, and mentally heavy. When most people start to slow down and quit, they continue. And that naturally makes us think they must have something special, maybe stronger discipline or a stronger willpower. But if you look deeper, you realize it's not that simple. Because what allows them to continue is not a fixed personality trait, but something that has been trained inside their brain over time. almost like a tolerance to boredom. When you do something long enough, your brain starts changing the way it reacts to discomfort. Instead of seeing boredom as a signal to stop, it slowly learns to tolerate it for longer periods. And this is the part most people miss, because they assume willpower is something you either have or you don't. But in reality, it behaves more like a muscle. The more you use it correctly, the stronger it becomes. And if you don't use it, it weakens. And the interesting part is that this mechanism doesn't get trained when you are doing things you enjoy. It only gets activated when you force yourself to continue at the exact moment you want to stop. When you feel bored, when you feel resistance, when you feel like quitting. That is exactly when your brain is being trained, not when everything feels easy. And the more important question now is this: if willpower really is a muscle that can be trained in this way, then how do you actually train it without overwhelming your brain from the very beginning and causing it to shut the system down completely? The real problem is not whether you are trying hard enough or not. It's that most people start in the wrong way from the very beginning. They think that in order to change themselves, they need to do more, push harder, be more disciplined. But that exact approach is what causes the brain to overload and shut down quickly. Because when you force your brain beyond what it can handle, it doesn't become stronger. It simply switches into protection mode and refuses to continue. And that's why so many people start with excitement but quit within a few days. Not because they lack ability, but because they set the bar too high from the start. But there is another approach, something more subtle and aligned with how the brain actually works. Instead of trying to suddenly exceed your limits, you simply go a little further at the exact point where you feel like stopping. Not doubling your effort, not forcing yourself into hours of extra work. Just a very small extension right after the moment you think you should quit. And that small extension is where real change begins, because it is enough to trigger adaptation, but not enough to create resistance. And when you repeat this process enough times, something strange happens. What felt uncomfortable today slowly becomes normal, and what you could only do for a few minutes begins to expand naturally without force. And from there, instead of focusing on big external results like weight loss or success or grades, you start focusing on maintaining this small system every day. Because the system is the only thing you can fully control, while results are not. And at this point, the question is no longer whether you are motivated enough, but whether you can maintain this small system long enough to get through the phase where most people quit. But even when you start doing everything right, there will still be a phase where it feels like nothing is changing. You are showing up every day, you are trying to maintain your system, but there are no clear results, no big improvements, no obvious signs of progress. And this is exactly the most dangerous stage. Because the human brain is not designed to trust things it cannot immediately see. It wants feedback, it wants evidence, it wants rewards. And when those things don't appear, it starts asking questions. Maybe I am wasting my time. Maybe I am not improving. Maybe I should stop. But the truth is, this is not a phase of no progress. It is a phase where progress is happening underneath the surface, like water being heated. For a long time, nothing seems to change. There is no visible movement. But energy is still building, structure is still shifting, until it reaches a threshold, and then everything suddenly changes very quickly. But the problem is, most people never stay long enough to see that moment. They leave right before the shift happens. And that's why they keep feeling like they fail, not because they are not improving, but because they quit too early. And once you understand this, the question is no longer, when will I get results? But can I continue through the phase where there are no results long enough? And if you change the way you see this, you will realize that the problem was never a lack of ability, but a misunderstanding of how progress actually works. And when you start seeing it this way, you stop asking, why am I not successful yet? And start asking, am I standing right before the next breakthrough without even realizing it? And in that moment, the way you see yourself and your consistency begins to change completely.